Hi, I'm KevDog, and well, it's finally time for the moment you've all been waiting for. A couple of years ago, me and my brother sat down to count down our thoughts on every single case in the entire Ace Attorney series, including the investigations games, and ranked all of them from worst to best. That video has since seen so much more attention than either of us could have ever anticipated. Thank you so much for all the continued support once again, both on it and our other more recent videos. Oh, by the way, I've brought my brother back for this video again too.
Hey, I'm 256Pi, or The Wonky Angle, back again after sitting the previous video out, aside from editing it. Anyway, anyone who's seen our big ranking of all the Ace Attorney cases may have been wondering about a certain game's noticeable exclusion from that ranking, which was originally announced with pretty damn inconvenient timing for us.
The Great Ace Attorney Chronicles. A full English translation of two previously Japan-only 3DS exclusive spin-offs to the series was going to see a full-on official release. We'd known these games existed in passing for years, since they'd originally came out way back in 2015 and 2017, but we were really not expecting it to be officially re-released and localized worldwide. We kinda assumed it was going to suffer the same fate as Investigations 2. Possibly requiring a full fan-made translation for anyone to be able to play it outside of Japan.
Unless it doesn't.
But lo and behold, here it was anyway. 10 entire new cases for us to play in English from the official source.
Given the timing of the game's release and how massive and complex and time-consuming our original case ranking was to make, as well as how far along in the project we already were when it was announced, we couldn't really make room for the Great Ace Attorney in that video, and we still only barely got a ranking just a few weeks before the game released. But now we've had a sufficiently long wait since then for this game and our thoughts on it to fully marinate. It's been about 3 years at this point. And for what it's worth, this wait has been necessary for us to be able to go into this game on the same level of detail that we were able to go into for the rest of the series, especially considering our usual perspective of looking back at the games after multiple playthroughs, compared to most fans who seem to only ever play the games a single time each and never return to them again. We want to make sure we can give you as informed a take as we can.
But now, the wait is finally over. We're going to be looking back at the Great Ace Attorney Chronicles, reviewing all 10 cases, just as we did the rest of the series, and even providing updates to our old ranking as to where each case in the new game might fit. Though we're not going in order of worst to best this time, we're just going to go through each one in chronological order and reveal their placement in our old ranking at the end of each one. As per usual, reminder that all of this is just our opinion and none of this is set in stone, especially since this game is still new by Ace Attorney standards. Our opinions here are more liable to change in comparison with any of the previous games, which have had several more years of consistent replay value for us to really cement our thoughts, which haven't changed in any significant way since we put up the original ranking, by the way.
Now, we had initially planned to cover the entire duology all in one video, but we ended up having way more to say than we expected, to the point where by pure happenstance, we ended up with a video roughly as big as our original ranking of all the other 40 cases in this franchise. And as such, just as we did with that video, we'll also be splitting this video up into 2 parts. This is part 1, and it'll obviously focus on the first game in this duology, The Great Ace Attorney Adventures. And obviously it should stand to reason that we'll be getting into full spoilers, but it is worth noting that it is possible we may have to bring up or at least hint at spoilers in later cases while talking about earlier cases, in order to fully communicate why our thoughts on them land in the particular way they do. The Great Ace Attorney is interesting for this series in that a lot of the cases feel markedly more interconnected and flowing together in a lot more of an overarching narrative than even what we're used to out of this series. It's not so well flowing to the same point as something like the Layton crossover, where the structure of the game adhering more to the Layton series would have the trial chapters not feeling like they could be judged as standalone cases at all. These are actual cases, obviously much more designed to fit in the usual Ace Attorney format, and we'll be judging them as such. But just be warned that if you've only played partway through the game and only plan to watch our segments on the cases you've already played, hoping not to get spoilers for how the game turns out later, we'll do our best to avoid it, but you might want to finish the rest of the game just to be absolutely safe before diving in.
Alright, now if you got all that, let's just get straight into it. Starting off with Case 1, The Adventure of the Great Departure.
You know, back in our original case ranking, we weren't especially kind to the intro cases of the games, most of which were all clumped together at the very bottom. We may have gotten some heat for that, but we stand by it. With the exceptions of Turnabout Trump and Turnabout Target, the intro cases have a pattern of feeling like they have way less substance and or much lower stakes than any of the longer cases further into any given game. Like they operate on a different lower standard from the other cases in the series. And to this game's credit, this first case looks like it may have been making a direct attempt to buck that trend.
The setup for the case is pretty familiar. You got your main character, Ryunosuke Naruhito, being accused of murder and needing to defend himself against plenty of evidence, like his fingerprints on the murder weapon from having picked it up, and a number of different witnesses who also saw him and possibly may have remembered things differently from him. It's an Ace Attorney case. We know the usual deal by now. But there are a few key differences right off the bat. First of all, Ryunosuke at this point is not a lawyer at all. He's just a random college student. He doesn't study law at all, he's never seen a trial before, and in fact, since this takes place in the late 1800s, trials in themselves are a relatively new thing in Japan.
The judge's beard is brown, so that's how you know how long a time ago this was.
This is, low-key, a really clever twist on the formulas we all know. Intro cases so often show a new defense attorney blanking on what cross-examinations even are, despite literally having studied them in law school and everything. But for Ryunosuke to not only not be a law student, but also live in a time and place where courtroom trials were still a somewhat new concept, gives him a better excuse than any other Ace Attorney main character to be super nervous and not have any damn clue on what he's doing. And fittingly, he has more nervous looking animations than any other Ace Attorney main character as well, which is great. No notes.
The one actually qualified to practice law, our Mia stand-in of sorts in more ways than one, is of course Ryunosuke's best friend and classmate Kazuma Asogi. Though obviously just from them being regular friends who are the same age rather than a mentor and student, that dynamic is going to be very different from Phoenix and Mia. Like Mia, Kazuma's self-confidence and deep-seated trust in Ryunosuke's abilities and innocence is able to provide Ryunosuke someone to lean back on and help him get through the case without losing hope. And he's also super well-spoken and a commanding presence right off the bat to the point where he feels like he could even be the main character himself initially. But unlike Mia, Kazuma is still just a student himself, and he has his own limits. There's a point in the case where Kazuma appears to have run out of ideas and given up altogether, something that a real Ace Attorney main character would never do in a million years. And from that point on, it's left up to Ryunosuke, who is able to notice more details and think outside the box better than him, to be able to carry himself, be able to rise up and gain his own self-confidence as the case rolls on. Not only does this deepen Ryunosuke's character and give him more development, with more of a pronounced character arc than most Ace Attorney main characters, that one moment where Kazuma gives up actually made me like his character a lot more than I might have otherwise, both in the way it breaks from the series' usual standard, but also in that it's a moment of real vulnerability that makes him feel all the more grounded and human. The two of them have a really strong dynamic together, where at this point in the game, both of them feel like they actively need each other to get by, and it's really damn well executed.
Wow, I wonder what's next for me.
You peaked.
What?
Unfortunately, we don't get to enjoy Kazuma's character on the same level ever again. We'll obviously get into how they handle him more later, but still, at least in this specific case, he is legit great and we can't take that away from him.
Now we have an actual case to talk about here, don't we? And it's one that seems to have slightly higher stakes than what we'd usually expect. Since the man who was murdered was a visitor from England, and Japan was in the middle of making some kind of international treaty with England, there's a high chance of some kind of international incident being sparked. We're not exactly in the same territory as 6-1, where if you lose, you literally die, but you know, it's something interesting to note and is given as more of a reason why either Ryunosuke or Kazuma may have more of a temptation to want to give up than usual. I'll admit I may have forgotten this point, since the one who talks the most about the treaty and the international politics is the Pain family ancestor, Ouchie. And much like his descendants, everything that comes out of that guy's mouth is basically just white noise with some bitterness and cowardice thrown in for good measure. Now with some sexism as a bonus. Not to say I don't enjoy him being here, if only because of this pose he makes sometimes. It's perfect.
But of course, what is a good case without some good witnesses to question? Where most intro cases would give you maybe one new character to question and presumably reveal as the real killer, this case gives you a vast selection of 4 witnesses: a waiter, Satoru Hosonoga, a sergeant, Iesa Nosa, A+ name by the way, an antiques dealer, Kiryo Korikuta, and whatever the hell Giselle Brett is supposed to be. Supposedly a student from overseas. Sure, let's go with that. For an intro case, that's quite a crowd to go through. Half of those characters are really solid and interesting, and half of them are not. In the latter category, we've already briefly touched on the old man Korikuta in our worst characters list. It's not so much that he's unenjoyable, he just doesn't offer anything worth caring about one way or the other. The full depth of his character is that he has a coin. Perhaps it might be a bit far to imply he's the worst side character in all of the Great Ace Attorney. I guess we missed the extra nuance that he talks like Yoda occasionally, and cares enough about that coin he's willing to completely ignore gunshots for it. And there is also that one moment where he accidentally stabs the sergeant in the foot. I guess that's kind of funny, but that's about it. He's also unfortunately kind of emblematic of the way the writing was handled for a lot of minor side characters throughout this duology, leaning more towards the level of character depth seen in the Layton crossover than what we typically expect out of mainline games in the series. Just surface level quirky, but not fleshed out enough to properly be interesting. A curio, if you will.
I'm not laughing at that.
I know. More than anything, he just strikes me as padding that doesn't absolutely need to be there, an attempt to make the case feel bigger without giving as much substance to back it up. It's possible to cut him out entirely and just give Ryunosuke a newspaper article about a rare coin being stolen or something like that, and the effect would have been exactly the same.
If you want an example of a character where they did have the substance to back themselves up though, just look at Iesa Nosa. He's at least in the same tier as a side witness like Johnny Smiles, where even if you're probably not going to remember him off the top of your head, once he's brought up, you're just immediately like, oh yeah, that guy was great. Once it's revealed that the sergeant has to carry around his baby son on his back and is barely doing a good job of hiding it, that's already an interesting layer to his character. We already get way more fantastic animations to look at, and the baby is even called Aidonosa. Again, A+. See, Spirit of Justice? Now that's how you do name puns! But the sergeant has a secret to reveal as well. Not that he's the killer, but that he's a petty thief. Apparently his salary as a soldier is so low that he can't make ends meet and feels the need to go around to high-end restaurants and pilfer expensive things being left around, including the coin in question, in order to get by and make sure his family can get something nice to eat. Also, he eats steak by holding it with his hands and biting into it. Incredible. Not only do all these details further endear us to his character, a lot of them are directly plot important, including the way he eats steak. That's the most important takeaway of all of them. No joke.
Though another character it's going to be important to get right is a good villain, a good killer. Ryunosuke distinctly remembers a woman present on the scene that none of the other witnesses are willing to corroborate him on, but with some pressing, it's revealed that the police coerced the witnesses into not talking about that woman or revealing she was ever there in the first place. You see, like the victim, that woman is also an English woman, an exchange student from overseas. It's bad enough to have an Englishman murdered on Japanese soil, but for the Japanese court to accuse an Englishwoman of such a crime would significantly increase the chances of some kind of international incident. Already the hiding of this fourth witness's existence is making her look mighty suspicious, but then she has to come in the court and look like this. Constantly covering her eyes with a mask that can magically expand and change shape to match her expression, or tilting her face down so that we never see her eyes. Really secretive and even blatantly racist to boot. And Payne is willing to roll right over with it. Right from the beginning, he's just already in kiss-ass mode and like, right then, could you please trouble the court with your name and occupation? And then, of course, I am Satoru Hosonoga. I am undercover working as a waiter.
Actually, before we get into Giselle Brett, can we please take a moment to highlight Inspector Hosonoga, who is the true MVP of the entire case. Better than the sergeant, better than Ryunosuke, better than Kazuma. This man absolutely freaking steals the show in this case, and we absolutely love him. I remember there used to be some theories about this character floating around before this game came out, that this guy might possibly be the first to kill her. But as it turns out, he is instead the first gumshoe. The man may be more reserved and polite, he may have much more self-confidence, as well as possibly tuberculosis, but as a detective, he is Gumshoe's equal in terms of both enthusiasm and competence. When a murder was committed and he realized he needed to draw up a floor plan for the crime scene, he drew it on his business card, which he would need to present to the court and thereby immediately blow his cover to literally anyone who bothered to turn the card around. When talking to this fine English gentlewoman, he needed to check whether or not she had a weapon on her. So he checked by asking her if she had a weapon on her. And she said she didn't. So I guess she didn't, right? God damn it. But when it really gets down to the wire, he'll make sure that you can count on him. He is committed to making sure his investigations are absolutely flawless. And that means in order to preserve evidence within a law enforcement system that only spends a day to examine crime scenes, he must break the law and steal all the evidence from the scene. He stole everyone's dinner plates and dinners for the sake of evidence preservation. He doesn't care if they call him a crime scene thief. It was all in the name of justice, and no one will get in his way. Give this man a raise. He probably needs it, given it's implied he just works a second job as an actual waiter at the restaurant. And shame on you, Ryunosuke, for disrespecting him in the case's outro. Anyway, what were we talking about before? Right, Giselle Brett. She's okay, I guess.
Gonna be honest, Giselle Brett isn't all that interesting a villain in the grand scheme of things. She's pretty standard as far as intro case killers go. It's not like there's any kind of surprise or mystery surrounding her status as the killer. General rule of thumb with Ace Attorney is that if your first impression of a given witness is that they seem more evil or villainous than anyone else around, they will be exactly the kind of person you think they are, and this rule is almost never subverted. Brett is about as unsubtle as they come, but despite how over-the-top her design and personality is, I don't know, she kind of blends into all the really unsubtle killers this series has given us over the years without really doing enough to stand out in her own right. We've seen her character type in this series lots of times before. The 1800s blatant racism is something different, sure, but that's more of a detail concerning the setting and time period than it is concerning her character in particular. He's far from the only openly racist character in this game, and honestly the whole racism element in this game is more interesting when it's being applied to more ordinary characters who are not blatant villains. Exploring the idea that racism is a mindset that anyone is susceptible to, much more frequently born out of ignorance rather than malice, even if no less harmful in either case. In Giselle Brett's case, though, it's just malice. The racism is there to make her look that much more evil, and that's less interesting.
A lot of time is spent on her, more than any of the other witnesses for obvious reasons, but a lot of that is establishing the specific murder method she used, which, by the way, makes this case's last third especially start to drag. From the moment Susato walks in the courtroom, the case really starts to go downhill for a while. Which is not Susato's fault. She did nothing wrong, don't worry. But what she delivered to the case was all this information about this really specific poison that can't be tested in Japan, on which a lot of time is spent delving into all the nitty-gritty and specifics of. And that's definitely the least interesting stretch of this case. It's just this whole detour that doesn't really amount to that much, and another point where everything feels a little unnecessarily padded out.
And all of that can leave us kind of conflicted where we might stand on this case as a whole. It's a big mixed bag. Is it better than most intro cases? Yeah, for sure, but not by nearly as big a margin as a lot of people have made it out to be. The parts of this case that are good are really freaking good, but it kinda has the same feel that most intro cases have, where it feels like there's less substance or importance or stakes than most of what's to come later down the line. They may have been trying to make this case feel more important and substantive and higher stakes, and some of the ways they attempted to do that were pretty clever, but a lot of what they do here serves more to just make the case longer rather than deeper. The international treaty stuff and your main character being an unqualified college student and all that is something, but it's still nothing compared to having to unravel an attempted presidential assassination that turns out to be fake and also involves Shelley the Killer, or discover that Phoenix Wright has become a very different person from the lawyer you once knew and the respectable-looking mentor figure helping you out is actually pure evil.
Not that it's even really fair to compare other intro cases to Turnabout Trump most of the time, but it's also worth noting that's a case that gets way better with hindsight. When you come back to play it a second time, knowing everything that's about to take place in Apollo Justice, it makes that case several times more intense than it was when you first played it. This is not one of those cases, and it does feel like it was trying to be. There's a lot of foreshadowing dropped, like the judge mentioning some kind of unspecified mission that Cosma has been assigned, or Giselle Bratt getting off scot-free at the end for political reasons, and being teased as a possible further threat later, or the name of the victim being John Wilson. All that sounds really important when you first see it, and some of it does become important. We'll get into all of that more later, but a lot of that doesn't amount to nearly as much as it might seem when you first play this case. A bunch of those plotlines teased to be something bigger end up not really going anywhere. They're J.J. Abrams style mystery boxes that turn up emptier than you thought. With all of that in mind, The Adventure of the Great Departure is a very solid and above average intro case, but in the grander scheme of the series is less special than it was trying to be, attempting the scale of a case you'd find in the middle of the game, but not getting all the way there in the follow-through. And as such, in our old ranking, we'd put it above Turnabout Serenade and below Turnabout Big Top. Case 2. The Adventure of the Unbreakable Speckled Band. Well, this is something different. For the first and so far only time, excluding the investigations games, here we have a case that features no trial segments. We see Ryunosuke stowing away on a Russian ship bound for Great Britain directly by Cosma's request. But what's this? Ryunosuke is in handcuffs, on suspicion of murder again. And the victim this time is Cosma? Oh no, he's been Mia'd? And wait, who's that weird guy in the brown suit who keeps jumping around and derailing every conversation within a 10-foot radius of him?
I think first and foremost the new star of the show at this point is one Herlock Sholmes, introduced for this case and making about as incredible a first impression as one can possibly make. Everyone knows the original Arthur Conan Doyle character who has the ability to pull out the most incredible deductions with attention to the most minor observations in order to solve mysteries, but this adaptation is of course a bit different from what one might typically expect. The first time Ryunosuke interacts with him, he's in the middle of examining the underside of a table while sitting on top of it. And immediately after that, he makes the brilliant deduction that Ryunosuke's true identity is in fact a fearsome revolutionary from Russia who's assassinated a dozen people and plans to blow up the Crystal Tower in London. How did he come to that conclusion? Well, he read about a revolutionary in the paper that morning. Said article includes a picture of the man who doesn't look even remotely like Ryunosuke, but no matter of that. If you're a revolutionary, surely you must be able to revolutionize your appearance, right?
This guy completely hogs the spotlight anytime he's on screen, and it's hard not to love every single second of it. Very few characters in the Ace Attorney franchise this side of the judge are able to deliver this many big laughs this consistently, and it seems like he just keeps finding new ways to top himself as the game goes on. The introduction of the Great Deduction mechanic is nothing short of brilliant, as you get to watch Sholmes spew complete nonsensical horseshit for 5 minutes to get a rise out of people. But since he still bases his horseshit on those most minor of details, which only someone like him could notice so quickly, it's up to Ryunosuke to correct the deductions into something that actually makes sense with the facts. Both of them jumping around and dancing and turning on random imaginary spotlights, the energy in these segments is nothing short of contagious.
And the fact that he's freaking called Sherlock Holmes is absolutely inspired as well. Sure, in Japanese he's just Sherlock Holmes, hence why the localization took such a long time to come out, and the tweaking of his name may just be a way to get around a copyright dispute. But going about it in the particular way they did is, first of all, the most fitting possible way for a series like Ace Attorney to go about it, with how much of a history the series has with silly character names, but also really furthers that feeling you get out of every appearance Sholmes makes, where you can't figure out whether this guy is an actual genius who just happens to love fucking around with people, or an egotistical fraud who's nowhere near being the brilliant mind he makes himself out to be. The game might honestly be made even better through that simple switching around of some letters in his name.
Anyway, there was a case to talk about here, wasn't there? The actual process of investigating this case is fine, I guess. There's not really a whole lot to look at. You get one cabin on the ship, you get the cabin right next to it, which is exactly identical to it, and you get the hallway outside. I mean, it's more visually appealing than, say, the embassy offices in Turnabout Ablaze, and the gimmicks of the ship making emergency stops and shaking and knocking over everything in the room is interesting too, but it feels like it kinda ends there. Otherwise, you're just looking around and seeing the usual Ace Attorney crime scene things. The obviously fake dying message written on the ground, the broken pieces of glass, wait a second, is that Inspector Hosonoga in a sailor outfit?
Right, Inspector Hosonoga is back. He may not exactly steal the show in this case like he did the previous one, but he's still just as much of a joy as he always is. It is really nice that when you have all these people around who are looking at Ryunosuke as if their minds are already made up as to who did it, here's the inspector who is able to extend some kindness and faith in him, letting him go investigate the cabin next door despite the circumstances of his arrest, promising to put his life on the line to help him, and making good on that promise as the ship's captain beats the shit out of him off screen for letting Ryunosuke out of his room. And on top of that, we even get to find out he's an enthusiastic ballet fan. It may unfortunately be true that he'll never be as important to the game as he is in these first two cases again, but he continues to be a legend anyway.
The other side characters who exclusively appear in this case are solid too. We got Beef Stroganoff, who is basically just heavy weapons guy if he were a sailor who owned a snake.
You think this is funny? Yet it's not possible!
And we also have the occupant of the cabin next door, the ballerina Nikolina Pavlova. I wasn't really sure about this character at first. They are sort of trying to make her an emotional core of the case, with her having run away from the ballet company and disguised herself as authentic English gentleman while stowing away her pet cat, and she didn't initially leave that strong of an impression. Though by the end, as they reveal her to be the real killer, having shoved Kazuma into the frame of his bed in a way that broke his neck, thanks to her thinking he was about to snitch on her to the police, even though he was actually just planning to consult Ryunosuke for a second opinion. Between her inability to trust Kazuma, who was still so nice and understanding to her, and her still feeling unsafe on a ship where every single member of the crew is friends with her and willing to cover for her by drugging all the ship's passengers, it feels like she's all but lost her mind to paranoia, and man, is that depressing.
But speaking of emotional cores, we've been remiss in mentioning that this case is our proper introduction to Susato Mikitoba. Sure, we may have met her for all of 2 seconds in the first case, but this is where we really start to get to know her, and she starts to slot into the usual assistant role. And she is about as fantastic as Ace Attorney assistants typically come.
She may initially distrust Ryunosuke out of her pure shock that Kazuma is dead, and he seems to be the most likely suspect on the surface, as well as her trust that the world-famous great detective who put him in handcuffs meant to do that honestly. Oh, and of course, tossing you headfirst into the nearest wall is A+. But as the case goes on, she still sticks by you to help Ryunosuke out in spite of her wavering trust, and she quickly realizes that she was in the wrong all along for suspecting Kazuma's closest friend, and feels guilty as hell by the end of it. The very ending of this case is knocked out of the park. as they mourn Kazuma and how much of an out-of-nowhere waste his death seemed to be, but also planned for Ryunosuke to take his place in Great Britain so that Kazuma's dreams can still be fulfilled in some way, it's exactly as much of a gut punch as intended.
Even if it is kinda strange that Kazuma supposedly died just from damage to one of his neck bones. Not shattered, just damage, according to the post-mortem report, and he had no other injuries. That seems like it'd be more comparable in seriousness to, say, getting hit in the head with a fire extinguisher, but whatever. Despite the odd circumstances of Kazuma's death, they do still make it feel suitably meaningful and focus just the right amount on how hard his loss hits all the characters involved, still hitting the right emotional note even on a second revisit.
This case may have its fair share of less interesting stretches, and the environment you investigate may not be the most interesting, but the characters involved, and especially the main characters, are able to carry the experience for us well enough, which leads me to feel like we can place it in our ranking right near the top of the bottom half. Better than the A Prison Turnabout, but below Turnabout Time Traveler. Case 3. The Adventure of the Runaway Room. Boy, this one's gotten pretty popular, hasn't it? I feel like I've seen a lot of people single this case out as one of their new favorites in all of Ace Attorney.
And no wonder, it's absolutely a statement of ambition for the Great Ace Attorney, trying to hit you with a whole bunch of twists on the usual formula you're used to out of this series and subvert your expectation. Whoa, is that Damon Gant?
Oh wow, not Gant's design looks even more intimidating and villainous than the real one. That's really something.
Yeah, talk about a character who just already looks like a final boss of some kind from the first second you meet him. Wonder what they're gonna do with him. Anyway, what were we talking about? Right, subverting expectations. There's lots of formulas in the world of Ace Attorney that we've just gotten accustomed to, so here comes a case that introduces a truly novel idea within this franchise's universe beyond any of our wildest imaginations. A jury.
I gotta say, the jury was not a game mechanic I was ever expecting to come into play for this series, but it really makes a great first impression. Already just being there and raising the stakes immediately every time one of the 6 random people decides to shoot one of their little fire.pngs into the big fire.pngs behind the judge, and it seems like your goose is already cooked way faster than what normally happens in Ace Attorney cases. You're on the verge of getting a guilty verdict completely out of nowhere right as we've barely gotten started. So here comes Susato to introduce us to the summation examination. This is an inspired idea, pitting jury members' statements against each other, finding a whole new way to uncover contradictions. They give each individual jury member a distinct personality, all of them with different perspectives on how to look at the case, and all seeming like regular people, more or less, like any Ace Attorney character would. And the soundtrack behind these segments absolutely kicks ass.
But of course, what's a good game mechanic if there's not a good case to back it up, right? And, well, honestly, aside from the fact that it takes place on a moving omnibus, hence the case's name, for the most part, it seems pretty standard fare by Ace Attorney standards, no pun intended. Ryunosuke gets shoved into it on ridiculously short notice, just moments after he arrives in England, so of course he has to figure out everything that happened on the fly. Stop me if you've heard this one, but it's a murder trial. The victim was killed by the defendant's own knife, there's blood on one of the defendant's gloves, and there were multiple witnesses who saw the moment of the crime, although it turns out none of them saw the moment of the crime. It was just easy to mistake what they witnessed as such. Not that each of the witnesses don't have something to them. There's the banker Bruce Fairplay, who always gets really worked up and eats his own cane and apparently has a gambling problem. There's the hat maker Lady First, who admits to having farted once and pretends to ride a horse when he gets angry. And there's the omnibus driver Beppo, who's always really cold and charged everyone a penny extra to ride. Well, the latter guy you mainly just feel sorry for more than anything. Alright, in the second half of the case, we're also introduced to Gina Lestrade, a pickpocket who's really open about being a pickpocket and just talks about stealing change from people in a court of law, knowing little to no consequences actually going to come to her for it. We'll get to her more later. Truth be told, while all of these characters are good, they're not the most well-developed when it comes to Ace Attorney side characters. The witnesses are about equally as deep as side characters as the 6 jury members are. Which I suppose is something impressive in its own right to introduce so many different characters out of the blue and give them just enough depth where they do all feel like they have something going on in their life outside of the courtroom, in spite of the case being even shorter than either of the previous 2 in this game. But again, the level of depth they're given is more comparable to the side characters in the Layton crossover than that of the mainline series, the kind of which don't need more than like a sentence to fully get the gist of.
But speaking of standard fare for Ace Attorney, we've got a new prosecutor, the legendary Reaper of the Bailey himself, Barak van Zieks. And pray forgive the discourtesy for saying such a thing, but he's just alright. Not bad, but not anything too far afield of what we've come to expect. The best thing about the guy is definitely his animations. The random wine pouring, hatred of glass, and even using his bench as a footstool. Amazing. All amazing. I love it. And it's also kind of funny that the sheer amount of sarcastic venom in his every line gets to such an extent that I had to look up to double check where the word learned was a racial slur of some kind. It's not. But aside from that, he's kind of the usual intimidating prosecutor character type that so many prosecutors before him have followed after. There's not really much of a twist to him to set himself apart from Von Karma or something, even in the way he visually looks. And the blatant racism, again, that's not really a character trait. That really doesn't tell us much about him as a person, as it does about the standards of acceptability in this society. Well, okay, societal norms don't actually play as much into it in his specific case, but we're getting way ahead of ourselves. Point is, as he's introduced here, he's fine enough as far as prosecutors go, but isn't among the best this series has to offer.
But all that aside, all of this has the potential to be the kind of thing we can just brush aside, considering what feels like this case is really hinging itself on is the sense of ambiguous unease that we've never really felt out of any other Ace Attorney case before in the same way. Ryunosuke did just get shoved into this case at the literal last minute and knows literally nothing about anything to do with the case, and that includes the character of his own client named Magnus McGilded. God fucking damn it, that's really his name. Anyway, the main appeal of this guy is that it's surprisingly difficult to tell whether or not this is the kind of person you can really trust.
The guy is exactly as rich as his name implies. They even model his character after taking a stereotypical Irish leprechaun and hue-shifting his clothes and hair 180 degrees. And on one hand, they make a big deal out of his supposedly being a good-hearted philanthropist who donates money to the government to get public parks built for the common people to enjoy and that kind of thing. But on the other hand, it also seems like he got his fortune out of conning people. He's a loan shark who apparently charges exorbitant rates of interest. Is this the kind of person we can really defend in court? Did he or did he not commit the crime? Even the jury goes back and forth all the time and can't settle on an answer. And every time their mind is changed, it makes sense for their mind to be changed. Let's make it clear. This particular kind of moral back and forth never happens in Ace Attorney. Generally speaking, you know exactly where you stand with your own client. Making sure you can trust them wholeheartedly is pretty much Phoenix Wright's entire ethos. And the only times when he takes on a client he can't trust is when Maya's kidnapped and he has no other choice. Ryunosuke has to directly deal with the moral dilemma of what a lawyer's supposed to do. Fight against his own doubts in his mind, and McGilded being the kind of character whose trustworthiness seems to flip on and off depending on what part of the case you're in, even presenting Ryunosuke with the opportunity to either win the case or throw his client under the bus thanks to the possibility that he may have just forged evidence right under his nose. And regardless of what you choose in that moment, resulting in still walking away from the case with a not guilty verdict on a lack of conclusive evidence to convict someone, leaving everyone just as unsure whether or not this really was the right thing to do. All of this is a brilliant idea. Or at least it would be if they didn't unfortunately fuck all of that up in this one quick moment. Or this moment which happens right after it too.
So, McGilded gets a faux breakdown and starts doing a full-on stereotypical evil laugh. I feel like this may be one moment where Ace Attorney's typical lack of subtlety really bit itself in the ass. The entire appeal of this case was that it was supposed to be a clever subversion of these formulas you typically know so well in this series, hinging itself entirely on focusing in on the gray area in this situation, not knowing whether this is the right or wrong thing to do, not knowing whether to trust your client, not having any definitive answers. All of these are not the kind of thing Ace Attorney ever does. Making McGilded evil laugh, however, gives the audience a definitive answer, letting you know exactly where to stand on McGilded. Yes, he did do it. Even if it's possible to look at the omnibus before and after the forging of evidence happened to piece together that he did that yourself, there's something inherently disappointing in a case previously building itself up to have an ambiguous ending, only to spoon-feed the answer in such an obvious on-the-nose way. And it's not like there's anything being subverted with the actual answer here either. I frankly was always predisposed to dislike a character named fucking Magnus McGilded for the exact reason that weird juror with the knife says. People as outrageously wealthy as McGilded are already never the good guys in real life. Knowing the way the series usually plays out with its unsubtle caricatures, if Ryunosuke had first run into this guy in a completely different situation where he didn't have to defend him in court, I would have immediately pegged him as a villain of some kind.
Now, all of that could also theoretically work. Sure, we as the audience know that McGilded did it the second he starts evil laughing, but walking away and getting a clearly guilty man off the hook is also something the series has never done before. The evil laughing looks like it could be some kind of heavy foreshadowing for something even more sinister to come, as Ryunosuke being put in the situation that he was could lead to further consequences down the line. Unfortunately, they had to throw in this little tidbit at the very end as well.
In there.
So to spoil the first 10 minutes of the next case, it's revealed that McGilded just died at the end of this case. He was trapped inside the omnibus and burned alive. That means absolutely nothing of consequence came of all of this. Not only did we not get the ambiguous ending the case looked to be promising, McGilded wouldn't even prove to be a future threat either. Sure, there's a further mystery left open of who killed McGilded, now left to be explored later, but the case of the murder in the omnibus we just tried to solve in court here pretty much just amounted to nothing. It completely went up in flames at the end. God fucking damn it!
I gotta say, replaying this case knowing where all of it is eventually going to lead, even with the extra knowledge other cases provide later on, getting to the end there is just really deflating, knowing so much of this will be pretty much meaningless in the greater scheme of things. There may be a lot of intrigue built and a lot of ambitious ideas attempted in this case, but it feels like they tripped over themselves and fumbled all of it with those couple of little extra moments in the ending. And what's left at the end is basically just a second intro case. Like a soft reset for the game, introducing you to the new setting, and that's about it. Is there still fun to be had along the way? Sure, the tension already built through the earlier parts of the case is still there and can still get us excited. The small character moments given to the witnesses and jurors are still entertaining, but all that wasted potential here is endlessly frustrating. And in fact, if we're being brutally honest, this flubbed ending may have actually resulted in this being cemented as our least favorite case in the Great Ace Attorney, and we're placing it exactly one spot in our ranking below this game's actual intro case. Pray forgive the discourtesy.
Case 4. The Adventure of the Clouded Kokoro. Alright, finally, the first Great Ace Attorney case to have both investigation and trial segments. Now we got something with a little more meat on its bones. In a lot of ways, this is a case that combines a lot of the things that already worked with the previous cases and brings them together without carrying over the big downsides. With a lengthier investigation segment, you also get a bunch more locations to look through, which are more visually appealing and varied than the ship cabins, and with a full trial segment to pay everything off. Telling a story that, like some others in this game, could be something of an anticlimax if not presented the right way, but still satisfyingly comes together. Also, new Von Zeke's animation just dropped. best one yet!
This case doesn't introduce any new game mechanics or that kind of thing. The game is finally establishing something of a regular status quo, but it is the introduction of a number of recurring characters that all become important. First we meet Inspector Gregson, quite handily the most competent and no-nonsense detective we've come across in this series, which isn't saying much, but still. There will be plenty more to say about this guy as we go further along and they explore a lot of the odd, morally gray space he occupies. As for now, we just know that he's constantly in a pissy mood and not about to take any shit from anyone, especially not that annoying self-proclaimed great detective. He's happy to get the boost in his reputation for being featured in the stories, but with how Sholmes has a tendency to show up out of nowhere to spout incomprehensible rubbish and upstage the police just doing their job, it's not exactly the friendliest of relationships. Of course, as little shit as Gregson will take from anyone, there is one notable exception to that rule.
The other biggest introduction for a major character is Iris Wilson, Sholmes' roommate and the author of the famous Sherlock-Sholmes stories. Also, despite being only 10 years old, she's an accomplished inventor who built the smoke grenade device that Gina Lestrade used in the previous case. She's also a qualified doctor of medicine, and her skills of observation and deduction are comparable to Sholmes himself. She already knew the full details of Ryunosuke and Susato's current situation just from briefly looking at them before she even knew their names. And of course, Inspector Gregson appears to be absolutely terrified of her. She's the one who writes the stories that give him such a special reputation in Scotland Yard that no other inspectors enjoy. And she has the power to take that all away from him. So he's quick to fall over backwards for her, even to the point of taking a bribe, appearance fee, from her, which lets Ryunosuke and Susato do more investigation than they would have otherwise. And continually referring to her as her ladyship, even while talking to complete strangers while she's nowhere that could possibly be in earshot, like he's afraid that even the slightest possibility of friction between them would be instantly detrimental to his career. Not scary at all. It's a good thing that she's as friendly and polite as she is, and on good terms with Ryunosuke and Susato, or she'd be a lot of trouble.
Now, getting into the case itself. So this story revolves around a woman getting mysteriously stabbed out of nowhere, supposedly perpetrated by a Japanese man who happened to be on the scene, one Soseki Natsume. This character appears to get somewhat mixed opinions from people, I suspect for similar reasons to someone like Spark Brushel, just in the fact that his visual design is kinda creepy looking and off-putting, and he gives off such weird, intensely nervous energy.
That and the constant alliteration and Denzel Crocker movements. While we won't act like Natsume is one of our favorite characters in the series or anything, for one thing, he does make for a surprisingly effective emotional core for the case to revolve around. Someone that Ryunosuke can connect with on the merit of just being a fellow Japanese person alone, perhaps struggles with the idea of defending due to the lack of possible exonerating evidence, as well as his own understandable misgivings with the English justice system that the previous case left him with. But coming around to realize that he should, like all Ace Attorney protagonists, come to trust in the innocence of his client in order to save him.
On top of that, I think it's worth noting that this character is directly based on a real person. Soseki Natsume was a real Japanese author from that exact era who did in fact live in London for a bit, and described his time there as the most unpleasant years of his life, going on to write such novels as I Am a Cat, which gets referenced in this game a lot, as well as Kokoro, after which this case and another later case in this game is named. The guy is apparently well known enough in Japan where his novels are widely taught in schools, and his face was even on the 1,000-yen banknotes for a period of time. Not the kind of reference that Americans like us would be likely to pick up on. Obviously neither of us had heard of him before looking this up, but one can just briefly skim over the guy's Wikipedia article and immediately be able to understand several choices that were made regarding his character.
Beyond that, there's a bit of a surprising theme running through this case and its exclusive side characters. Of married couples. The most focused on couple is the Garadebs, who live upstairs above Natsume's lodgings, You have John Garadeb, the former military man who committed the most dishonorable of deeds by entering the occupation of landlord, and who has the absolute most entertaining of British accents of any character in this entire series.
What's all this baloo then, eh? Ah, yes, quite jolly good pistol look and all that, and dash it all down, kindly stop pouring tea on my balls!
And there's also his wife, Joan, who pretends to be his maid for the sake of making them appear more upper class than they actually are, and who may or may not be a domestic abuser. At one point, John brought home a book that happened to have someone's love note left inside as a bookmark, which sent Joan into a flying rage, throwing everything in the entire room at him. Books, knives, candles. Part of the room even got set on fire, and this wasn't cause enough for her to stop, because it'd be bad for the nerves or something. At first it seems like their spat may be something unrelated to the case, an excuse for Mr. Sholmes to dance around the room and make up fantasies of a loose lion in the room being subdued by the family cannon they happen to have lying around, as I'm sure all families do. But of course, it comes to pass that one of those knives Joan threw likely flew out the window and may have been the very knife that the victim was stabbed by, landing on her by pure chance. Another case where technically everything happened on complete accident. Of course, coming to that conclusion is slightly complicated by the appearance of some other witnesses.
If there's anything tangible to criticize this case for, the most notable point is that I'm not a fan of the witness couple, Constable Rolly Beat and his wife Patricia. Get it? Pat and Rolly Beat, patrol the beat, haha, thank you, Ace Attorney. The constable is most characterized by the fact that he is constantly falling asleep due to the insane workload required of his profession, which includes walking 20 miles a day. Also, his wife is clearly the dominant one in the couple who does the vast majority of the talking on the witness stand. I mean, they're okay enough, and have typically entertaining animations such as Patricia grabbing Rolly's fists and using him as an almost literal puppet, or Rolly occasionally ending sentences by violently leaning back out of nowhere.
Lean back.
But at some points their super lovey-dovey shtick gets old, and there's a lot of time spent on them thanks to Rolly having moved the entire crime scene out of his jurisdiction so that they could go out for an anniversary dinner. The parts involving them are definitely where the case drags the most. There's also a whole section with the jury about one of the jurors having slipped on the ice around the time of the crime that doesn't go anywhere either, but all the business with Juror 5 who does construction work and also has marital problems of his own is mildly entertaining in its own right.
Still, as far as complaints go, that's pretty minor in comparison to our problems with the previous cases. At the end of the day, this case doesn't do anything absolutely outstanding in the greater scheme of the series. There's nothing here we absolutely love, or that would make it rise among the best the series has to offer. But there's not much here we can complain about or actively take issue with either. It's an all-around consistently very good case, if never a truly great one. And in the ranking, I think it can go exactly one spot above where we put Case 2 in this game. Though Turnabout Time Traveler has higher high points, so that would still rank above this. Case 5, The Adventure of the Unspeakable Story. And now, we've finally reached the finale of the first game. Easily the biggest scale case we've gotten yet, and the first one to, well, functionally have 2 investigation segments and 2 trial segments like most Ace Attorney cases. Even if the investigation and trial parts are put together like one really long investigation and one really long trial. It may not surprise you to hear that this is probably the best case of the first game of the duology, but it may surprise you to hear that it's not by nearly as much as you'd expect. As entertaining as this case often is, I have to say it's another surprisingly big mixed bag that doesn't come close to a lot of other finale cases in the series.
Not for a lack of trying, mind you. Certainly the case has a particularly strong start, and the investigation sequences, with only minor exceptions, are definitely the highlight of everything on display here. Among the first thing that happens is coming across Sholmes delivering an exceptionally amateurish and off-key performance on his violin. We proceed to talk to him and find out the man has given up all hope in humanity and wishes to die. His newfound lack of violin skills has resulted in his instantly falling into such an intensely deep depression the likes of which we've never seen anything quite like out of him. Relatable. But of course we quickly examine his violin and realize that he accidentally traded it for a viola while attempting to take his actual violin out of safekeeping from the local pawnbrokers. And this immediately brings his spirits back as he exclaims, "Never trust a pawnbroker, they will try to fiddle you every time!"
Next, it's time to go to the pawnbrokers and meet the plot. Well, first we meet the pawnbroker himself, one Pop Windabank, and... okay. I mean, I already ranted about this guy at length when we did our worst characters list video, but just to reiterate, the joke of this guy constantly threatening to commit suicide is quite possibly the single worst attempt at a comedy bit this series has ever done. Not only is it way more uncomfortable than funny and exceedingly tone deaf to be playing such a thing for a joke in the first place, even if the music all but informs the audience that the guy has no plans to go through with his threats, I fail to see what the point of all of it was in the first place. Like, if I'm generous, I guess we needed to know that he had a gun, and the game wanted to demonstrate this fact to us in such a way that made him look as unthreatening as possible. But there was absolutely no need to convey this information in such a way that gives you such unnecessary heart attacks, and plays a man threatening to end his own life for a fucking joke! Especially as they show in later scenes that the man isn't even close to being as cowardly as he looks. I really wish the case had focused more on that side of his character, since there was something interesting there.
Anyway, on to more pressing matters. This case marks the return of Gina Lestrade, showing up to redeem a small overcoat from a pawnbroker's ticket, and trying to pawn off a suspicious music box sticks.
I'm just like,
that was inevitable. And trying to pawn off a suspicious music box disc that she thinks ought to be worth a lot more than Windabank is offering her for. Though suddenly, who should arrive but this dapper, not at all suspicious gentleman who identifies himself as one Eggert Benedict, claiming that Gina has stolen these articles from him. First and foremost, let us establish that this character is one of the funniest looking villains we've come across in the series. The way this man wildly flails his arms about in order to assert dominance is nothing short of an absolute laugh riot every goddamn time. And never gets old. It should also come as little surprise that Sholmes has to show up and center his latest dance of deduction around him, one of the most entertaining such segments yet, as the man he's examining gives off equally as unhinged, chaotic British gentleman energy to match Sholmes himself, is just perfect. And the way Benedict fucking pulls a gun on you and then does a goddamn ballet pirouette to escape the cops arriving on the scene, just A+s all around. The work of the motion capture actors and character animators for this entire duology cannot be praised enough.
Going from there, we next get a scene back at the Baker Street place, where we get to hear some backstory for Iris and why her living situation is the way it is. We get a new mystery to tie up another day, when Susato reveals she knows the title of the story that Iris wrote, but by Sholmes' own oddly out-of-character request, was never able to publish. All very intriguing, but we then get another appearance from Gina Lestrade showing up to visit them. They get a whole nighttime talk about how Gina's grown up, never able to trust anyone, bunch of solid little emotional moments through this whole segment. And then finally, after all that, the plot significantly thickens as Gina snuck out to the pawnbrokers at night to check whether or not Sholmes was telling the truth about keeping Iris's novel in safekeeping as he promised, only to find herself in the middle of another murder, this time of Mr. Windabank himself, and with her being taken in as the prime suspect, because of course. Oh, and Sholmes was even shot while trying to pursue the real culprit as well. Now, a mere 2 hours into the case, it feels like the story has finally properly gotten through all the setup and started up for real.
The following investigation mostly goes along as usual. Iris comes along with you, so we get to see Gregson act that much more nervously around her. Still weird.
But hilarious.
You get to learn about stereoscopes. That becomes a whole running thing for the case, which results in getting to see many a character go cross-eyed, including the judge much later on, an image that was always destined to be. Side note, I do think the trial would have been much better off with less of the stereoscope stuff. That whole aspect of the case gets a little played out and doesn't work as well as I assume it would have when the game originally came out on 3DS. A lot of very literal headaches to potentially be had, but I digress. You also get to use Iris's and Sholmes' forensic inventions and test blood on the crime scene, and you get to find out that Susato has been called back to Japan by her father who has ostensibly fallen ill, and you get to make your tearful goodbyes with her at the very end, sort of. But probably the most important part of the whole investigation is getting to talk with Gina Lestrade in the detention center. Getting her to finally let her guard down and let you defend her in court does make for one of the strongest emotional moments in this case. They also throw in a revelation that this case is closely intertwined with the unresolved Case 3, talking about how McGilded threatened Gina into committing perjury in that case in order to help him get away with his crimes, and even finding direct, undeniable proof that McGilded was in fact the real murderer in that case by Iris testing the overcoat for bloodstains. The latter point probably would have hit a lot more effectively if, the game didn't already drop such unignorably heavy hints in Case 3 that this was in fact the truth of the matter, but they do at least kinda cleverly turn it around into further demonstrating Ryunosuke's resolve to expose the truth and defend Gina in the face of all the uncomfortable realities he's faced with. Kind of doing a similar thing like Case 1, where they're delivering the same familiar themes from all the other Ace Attorney games about believing in people, but presenting them in a way that actually comes off more meaningful than usual. Also in the way that Ryunosuke and Gina's trust in each other is really put to the test in the trial itself, as Ryunosuke has to present the full truth of what happened in Case 3 publicly to the court, and get Gina to admit to having committed perjury on the stand in order to fully clear her of the murder. I thought the way they handled that was really clever, and it also doubles as a way to get Prosecutor Von Zieks to let his guard down on you ever so slightly, dropping the first real hints that maybe the man is not nearly as evil or corrupt as he might appear.
But while we're on that topic, the trial. It's really damn long. Not to say that there isn't plenty of entertaining stuff along the way, like the jury being almost entirely compromised of people we've already met before.
Comprised, not compromised.
Fuck. Entirely comprised of people we've already met before in some way, including John Garadeb, or the old guy who slipped on the ice in the last case and turns out to be Sholmes' surgeon. Or that Russian revolutionary guy that Sholmes was spending all of Case 2 accusing other people of being. That guy turns out to not amount to anything important in the grander scheme of the Great Ace Attorney and never appears again after this case, which in itself is utterly hilarious. There's also the scenes near the end with Sholmes appearing from out of nowhere disguised as a goddamn bailiff to provide you with Susato's last crucial piece of evidence, and then announcing if you'll excuse him, he has to pass out now. And more importantly, it also marks our introduction to Nash and Ringo Skulkin, who are the fucking best. They're just the best! The goofy accents, the Mario and Luigi designs, and the randomly eating apples and pears, them being terrible at their jobs and making lots of lies that are all ridiculously easy to disprove, including accidentally disproving each other, them trying to search for their supposed third brother and treating Gregson as part of their little club. And every single damn facial expression they make is absolutely priceless. I cannot get enough of any moment these two scoundrels are on screen. Oh yeah, and the fact that they were childhood friends with Eggert Benedict, and the fact that we get to see a little scene in the credits of all three dancing together in prison, absolutely perfect! But on the other hand, despite its best efforts, boy does this trial drag on. And that's not really so much the fault of the Skulkins, as it is that Benedict bloke.
Yes, for the record, we know Eggert Benedict is not his real name. He's really called Ashley Graydon and was born Ashley Milverton. And side note, the fact that everyone just immediately knows that Eggert Benedict is not a real name is low-key one of my favorite jokes in the entire duology. Coming from the franchise that's given us so many real-sounding names over the years, such as Believe in Me, Wendy Oldbag, Furio Tigre, Beef Stroganoff, Salmonella, Iesanosa, I'll Be Your Guide, Lady First, or Magnus McGilded, we haven't even gotten to Albert Hairbrain or William Shakespeare yet. All perfectly believable names in this universe, but a name like Eggert Benedict? Oh no, that's just a bridge too far. No one would be fooled by something so ridiculous. But whatever, even if that's not his real name, Eggert Benedict is just what we're always going to call him and continue to referring to him as. That name stuck in our minds way more than the guy's real name. Which is also kind of emblematic of the fact that as a villain, he's kinda weak and difficult to get invested in. As mentioned before, the guy is very visually entertaining, but as an actual character, there's not really much there. Well, there's a lot there, actually, just nothing all that interesting or compelling that would get you to care about him beyond the surface level of haha funny dancing egg person. They do give him a pretty in-depth backstory about how he grew up poor and his dad was that one brickmaker who was the victim in case 3, I guess. But he also hated being among the poor, so much so that he would go so far as to work in cahoots with McGilded to steal government secrets to sell them off, and he also used the music box discs to hide the secrets via Japanese Morse code, which his dad made for him or something. I don't know, man, it's whatever. This is still a character who in the grander scheme of the game was introduced relatively last minute and doesn't feel nearly as satisfying to take down as he probably should. He's no finale villain, just kind of an average villain that they had to go into more detail with because it's technically the last case in the game.
I, for one, think it's a missed opportunity that McGilded was killed off immediately after Ryunosuke got him off the hook. Now that's someone who could have worked more effectively as a finale villain, both in terms of his actual personality and presence, and how it could have brought the story of Case 3 around full circle. And maybe even seeing these other characters like Edgar Benedict and or the Skulkins bounce off of him as his underlings would have been fun. Alas, we got what we got.
There's also this whole thing with Gregson, where they decide to delve more into that morally gray space he occupies, both well-intentioned as well as kinda underhanded and corrupt. The whole time he's so desperate to make sure those government secrets don't get leaked to the public that he goes as far as to make a deal with Edgar Benedict to get that disc from him right on the stand and hide the evidence on one of the Skulkin brothers. I mean, it's definitely an interesting angle to go about his character, and it does feel like it serves a purpose and context, especially as they thematically tie that into Susato having tampered with the crime scene in order to trap the killer in his lies, and doing a whole self-loathing thing for having broken the law like that at the very end. But also the way all of Gregson's underhanded efforts entirely prove futile, with the music box Morse code just getting publicly played in court anyway with Von Zeke's full approval, kinda just makes all his efforts feel like further padding in the moment.
Cheers to revealing government secrets in court. One potentially really interesting thing that this case does is leave open a bunch of loose ends and leave this game on something of a cliffhanger to be resolved in the second game. No pun intended. In the very final scene, where you see Susato off and they translate the Japanese Morse code message to find out Kazuma, Gregson, and John Wilson are all mentioned in it, that's a really interesting hook to leave us off on. And all these lingering questions are to be answered in the sequel. But at the same time, there's also definitely a part of me who wishes this ending actually left even more things unexplained than it did. Really, it's just this one loose end that was closed up during Edgar Benedict's confession, which I view to be a major misstep. And that's the fact that they reveal Edgar Benedict was the one who orchestrated McGilded's death from being set on fire in the omnibus. We'll get more into why this specific point turned out to be so frustrating later, but long story short, there was a ton of foreshadowing in this game that hinted at the importance of the Curse of the Reaper. The whole mystery of how people that Von Zeeks prosecutes always seem to turn up dead, whether or not he successfully gets a guilty verdict. The police appear to be taking it very seriously, and this mystery gets even more important in the second game. But revealing Edgar Benedict to have killed McGilded with Inigo Montoya style motivation, I mean, it technically makes sense, but it also makes the whole Reaper of the Bailey curse look like no more than a set of unfortunate coincidences, and the whole reveal feels like a total anticlimax.
Well, to be fair, they couldn't have done the Reaper of the Bailey mystery at the same time as leaving McGilded alive for this case like you wanted. You would have had to go with only one or the other for it to work and not both. But the way these cases were actually written chooses neither option, leaving both of those possible paths to fall short of their full potential in that unsatisfying middle ground, the most frustrating possible outcome. At the end of the day, this is still a good case. There are tons of fantastic moments scattered throughout it, both in terms of the big laughs and the multiple more emotionally heavy moments with Iris, Susato, and Gina Lestrade. Gina is probably just straight up the single most emotionally compelling defendant the duology has to its name. And even if the case may have plenty of less interesting padding, it's still not nearly as egregious an offender as, say, Turnabout Ablaze. At no point in the case were we not at least entertained. But there's also too many unsatisfying or confusing missteps to just overlook and say all the good in the case fully made up for it. And in spite of this being the longest individual case in the whole duology, there's also the sense that despite this technically being a finale case, it's not actually built to be a special send-off in that way. If the Runaway room case functionally felt like a second case 1 disguised as a case 3, this case is functionally a case 3 disguised as a finale, both feeling too long but also somewhat incomplete at the same time. In our overall ranking, there's enough good here to get it one spot above Turnabout Time Traveler, but absolutely no higher than Turnabout Samurai.
And that'll be the end of part 1 of this video. Stay tuned for part 2 where we discuss our thoughts on the Great Ace Attorney 2 Resolve, coming up real soon.